I think when I last told Alex what my talk would be about, it was going to involve probing questions. But actually it's not. Yeah, it's strange. It feels like I knew Alex for some time because I've made him scream in anger at me before. But all that's just part and parcel of collaborating on code. And I have this relationship with a few people in this room, purely, you think it's a real relationship, but actually it's just on email and Skype. There's a few collaborations I've done. It's fantastic to actually be here. Thanks, Alex, for inviting me. I don't often talk in public these days, so bear with me. I will try and not use the word fuck too often, for example. Thanks. I thought it'd be good to have a funny title to my talk, because anyone who's done any Gen or at least GenExpr will notice that exactly. But of course, it's just a generic piece of code. Anyone who's done any code. When Alex asked for a title, I decided this would be a fun thing to use because it's got an open bracket. And then Alex emailed me back and said, "Pete, I got your title, thanks. Do you not mean that?" Firstly, Alex closed the bracket. And secondly, he laid it out in a way which most coders would agree is the best way to lay out code. For debugging, you have both brackets in the same place. And I thought that said as much about me as it did about Alex. I wanted to get across that I'm basically a fraud, and I feel that many Max users are, I suppose, or at least users of this sort of software, creative coding software, for want of a better term, and how we end up doing what we do, and why. But I was assured that this one would be full of geeks, and so I'm just going to really talk about Max patches for the first half of the talk, and I'm going to show you some patches, show you what I've been doing, and then hopefully they'll lead to more interesting questions a bit later on. So as Alex said, I've been working with Surreal Machines. I am Surreal Machines, one third of now, with Matt and Alex. And the first project we wanted to do together, just myself and Matt, was can we work together? So we thought, let's choose something really boring that no one will be interested in, a delay. And it turned out it became quite the hit. And these things we released with Ableton have been very popular, and it always fascinates me that people still want delays, but it was interesting, Casper's talk earlier talking about how he'll always just need a delay and a fuzzbox. And it seems people do. What we actually did is we released two devices, I'll show you. One of them diffuse, which is a sort of delay reverb, and another one magnetic. I'll talk mainly about magnetic, and I'll go through some of the processes I went through when they were working on the details of the code. So what I was interested in is not just making a delay, but we wanted to make a sort of analog emulation delay. Whatever that means, we'll come to that later as well. And we didn't just want to do something predictable, but we wanted to have fun with it and put our own ideas into how could we shoehorn our own thinking into this idea of a delay and an analog emulation delay. And I must say, I'm a big fan of this device. I really like it. Which isn't often the case when you're working on something in a purely technical level for other people, which I'll also come on to later. And I'm just going to show the gen patches. The thing about analog delays is that they all share certain things and have to have certain features in common. and that is to sound like, well, tape delay, to sound like a piece of tape. And so in our preamp section, we have some functions I will ignore. We have input, dry, high pass and low pass to basically curtail the frequency of the audio source, and so even the dry comes out different. Then wet, we take whatever that is, and again we put it through saturators and curtail low pass and high pass, then output. So it's actually a very simple graph. In this, all the filtering is done with custom filters, which are in functions up here. There's two different types of one-pole filter, and this is a recurring theme of what I'll talk about today. If I was doing this in MSP, and in fact the first prototype was in MSP, I would just use one-pole tilde, and which is fine. It's a very fine filter, especially since Max 6 it was remade slightly. The problem I have with one pole is there's only one of them. And really, if we're to be creative with the details of sound, we should really have 5 one poles. I think we have 4 in our shared library at the moment. And it makes a difference because the way they cut the tape sound and the steepness of how they cut it feels completely different. And all this stuff is very important for delays with feedback, because once you start feeding things back, what you've done to them has huge consequences on the pitch of the feedback of the outcome. Output stage, very similar. Again, there's lots of custom smoothing devices. These are just to smooth parameters. They're very simple, low pass type things. Here we mix and we have low and high shelf filters. So if we go to our plugin, we'll see this up here, bass and treble. That's just in the output stage, low and high pass filters. And here we have the coefficients for those filters, which is exactly like filter graph or filter coef in MSP. Just shelf sections, and it's hugely expensive doing it inside Gen. And so there's a sort of lower quality mode where it does calculation outside of Gen, so just using message rate max. In fact, it's a JavaScript which does it. So you'll see over here the processing 2x and 4x. This actually sneakily also changes a few other things like that behind the scenes. And this is oversampling rates, but also these other sort of technical, more CPU expensive, but worth it, we hope, if you choose these options. And again, this is just a graph where you stick everything together. We've got, what order did this go in? We've got dry, filter, low, high pass shelves, and saturators, final saturators. Saturation is something which we've just literally spent months on, because it's really important. And again, it's something which Cycling 74 and MSP don't really spend enough time on. They sort of do spend some time on it, but not lots. And it's with Gen, it's become possible for us to take control and spend time on these details of the sound, which I think are what make something your own, or at least make this device our own, as opposed to something more generic. There's a reason it's all in GenExpr, which I'll talk more about later, but there's a problem with Gen, and the problem is, there's many problems. The problem is in a normal Gen patch, you cannot control CPU like you can with Poly or Dynamic DSP. You can only control CPU in Gen with GenExpr. And by doing that, that's basically if-else blocking. If this condition is met, use this CPU. If it is not, do not, and then this will not be computed. So if you're making a massive patch, this is a real problem. You have to go to GenExpr, especially if it's for multiple use consumption. This is the other device we made, Diffuse, and you'll see that it's able to be completely in patch Gen, because it's never off. It's an always-on device, in that the feedback network is always going, and there are no clever options for the user. It's one thing, and it's one of the reasons it's very beautiful, and it also is really easy to export to C++ using code export, because it's a single block object, this one object here. But there were two reasons we couldn't do that with magnetic, and one of them is this, which of course you'll all recognise. Mr. Harker makes an appearance once again. We used convolution engine for our spring reverb, which was used to emulate a Roland 201 spring. We look no further, of course, than Alex's convolution engine, which is in a poly, so we could turn it off. And so once you've got two signal paths, some of it in MSP land, gen is no good, we have to use multiple gens. That's one of the issues with it. And you'll notice this convolution is in a poly, purely for CPU muting, whereas the large tape section, which I'll show you in a minute, is only in GenExpr because it's easy just to turn it on and off with an if-else block. This is a key feature that Matt and I, when we were developing it, said we want this great spring IR. And of course we couldn't leave it at that, and in the end we ended up making the device more us-like by choosing lots and lots of different IRs, including effects like an amplifier, for example. So you've got a Roland 201 emulation, except instead of a spring reverb, you can mix in dynamic convolution with a tape or an amplifier sound, which is again a classic thing you do when you patch for yourself. Is you just think, well, I just want to add this other thing in. Of course, it's a problem when it's meant for other people. What time did I start? Was it about quarter an hour ago? Okay. So, back to.
What does that sound like to you?
I'm going to play it very soon. Back to tape system, and this is where it all happens. And this had to be in one block because we're using a single sample feedback, and so your entire tape loop has to be in one block of code, purely for that reason. And again, that's a limitation of Gen. And there are lots and lots of functions here, but basically what I wanted to show you was this bit. If m equals 0. So if mute, that's m, is not on, then process. And the entire block is all within this condition, and it doesn't get turned off until here. This is the else don't process, and do lots of other stuff which Alex will shout at me about because there's things which need to happen. And again, here we spent ages working with saturators, the right sort of saturation, it's up here, and writing to tape and how that might feel and the frequency response. And there's dynamic changes, so it's not just a fixed system, but depending on what other parameters are going on in the plugin, the frequency response of the feedback loop will change and things like that. So it's got its own little life, which is a very dangerous thing to do when you're building a plugin, which for lots of people, which is supposed to be recreatable states. It's quite hard to do that with magnetic. So that was a quick look at the two different types of code setup between the two devices. I thought I could make a cool set explaining, showing how great this sounds, but I thought seeing as in a room of Max heads, I would just use a Max sound. So this is the spring reverb impulse response mixed in with the delay, and originally you heard the amp. Which is of course ridiculous to have in a delay, but interesting. hear it's a heavily saturated sound. That's what we were going for.
Hear it dry just for
Yeah,
anyone who doesn't know the most example sound.
So it's very coloured. It's a very obvious thing is to do to replicate this delay, because it's a very famous delay, a Roland Echo 201, and it's been done many times in devices. I have no problem with saying this is my favourite emulation. There's a very famous one by UAD, all of them are very famous, and the problem I have with the UAD one is it's of a device which I don't think exists. It's completely perfect and beautiful, and it's always completely reproducible state, and it sounds like it's just come out of the factory. Whereas I think we went specifically not to do that. We wanted it to sound like a slightly beat up device. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the sound shaping options just so you can hear a few things. The crucial thing is the sound of the feedback is very, very old and saturated regardless of the mode you're in. And also the routing, which I'll do just after. Feedback. So yeah, we spent a long time making that sound like it sounds. That thing about the feedback loop and the tiniest of changes. I even went back to do an update of the device and found quite a few mistakes we'd made in the first version. And when I corrected them, it broke everything, and it sounded wrong. And the thing is, the crucial thing about people like us working in something like Max and Max Power is that the way we'll work is usually just with our ears and sound going through it all the time. So there's this environment, we know how it works, but it's not like coding in C, and Gen isn't even like that. But these things were possible because of Gen, the way we could be so specific about the sound and do it in a way which didn't sound like stock MSP objects. I'll just quickly change the mode selector so you can hear a few different
Wow as well.
modes. No.
No.
So this is with no reverb. As I change the mode selector knob, you'll see the text above change and tell you what I'm changing it to. So you're just clicking between different head readouts of the delay. So there's 3 tape heads, basically. There's also lots of handmade mistakes on purpose. So this mode has what's known as a Matt Jackson special, which is just slightly skewing the left-right delay times in a way which is not something you could say is analog emulation. It's creator interjection. And it sounds slightly ping-pong. And just finally, the last thing we did, which is very different from all these original hardware units, is routing of the reverb. So it usually happens in parallel, and you just sum it. But here we gave options for the reverb being post or pre the delay, so you can get some really crazy sounds if you then use the mix, the gain knobs into them. So I hope the short demo gives you a sense of the sound world of it and what we tried to do with it, and also how Jen made it possible for us to play with these details and make these interjections and stay interested in the project ourselves more than anything, rather than just doing it textbook. I didn't do wow, but I was just joking. I was going to do wow, but I should move on. Alex fixed the wow in the second version. That's what he wants to hear.
What did he do in the first?
The first version, it was my one, and I was convinced I could hear it working after too many weeks in a row working on it. But the other thing that happened is I'd done something like my LFO. I'd scaled it, and so it changes with time, whereas of course it shouldn't. Alex realised this when he was going through our code. The reason Alex has been going through the code with us is that we're actually working on a VST plugin, not of this, but inspired by this. So we're using some of the ideas, again, to sort of test us working together as well. So I better move on and show a few other patches. So I actually find working in Max for Live, at first I found it quite difficult. I'm not used to it feels like you're in a little box. And with Max, it's open. This is probably purely psychosomatic, but that's how it felt to me. And you have to get used to it being a different sort of entity in live. And there's not enough time to go into live issues, I suppose, but it's worth remembering it is a very different experience working with it. Before building these together, Matt and I were actually researching ideas, but they tended to be quite specific DSP ideas and things we wanted available to us when working with Max. We were working in Max 6 for that project, but that's basically what I had been doing anyway. Since my very first use of Max, whenever a new release of Max would come out, instead of be happy about my large collection of personal abstractions that you're supposed to build up, I would throw everything away and I would start again. This is the sort of thing I do, but it felt stupid. I was never happy. There was always some new feature. I learned how to do something better because you're constantly learning in an environment like this. The first software Max, I haven't done that with, is Max 7. It might be because I don't really like Max 7 very much, but it's also because it seems like I'm getting somewhere now. Finally, I'm getting a library of reusable code that I know exactly what it is and I can go and get it. And so I've been researching that for some time, since the beginning of Max 6, and I got my hands on Gen, which was a real godsend for me at the time. I thought, right, now I can do the things I wanted to do. In Max 5 I had become quite disillusioned with Max. I started using Super Collider a bit and hating it, and eventually I found Lua AV, which I want to mention later, which is an amazing piece of software. But I came back to Max because of Gen, basically. It allowed me this detail. Obviously I'm someone who likes this sort of detail. So what I want to do is just show a couple of filters that I collated recently to show Alex. Ladder emulation, and we all need ladders. Even if you don't realise it yet, you do need ladders, and so it's an important thing to have in your arsenal. And I spent ages working with different filters such as this, and this is a collaboration between me and Matt and Graham Wakefield at Cycling 74. And one of the key things about this ladder is it's a zero delay feedback filter, meaning it gets rid of the unity delay in the feedback chain, which means you can achieve a far a smoother and richer sweeping of the filter cut frequency. And the other great thing about ZDF zero delay filters, feedback filters, is you can change the non-linearities in the filter in real time, because they don't depend, the tuning of the filter doesn't always depend, depending on the sort you make, it doesn't always depend on the type of saturation you have in the filter, which is really exciting from a, creative point of view. So if you just have a quick listen to this, I'm going to change some. So when you use them in a certain context, that can be really amplified, and especially if you change the drive, the gain of the signal going into it. I will show you some code, but not of this one. This is Gen at work for us. First of all, you have to resolve feedback with no delay. And so one of the issues we discovered working on this is that you have to do that in only one patcher in Gen. You can't sub-patcherize these different one poles or the saturation at the side, because then sub-patchers think they need another sample delay. What's it called? History. Another history. And so that was one of the fun things we discovered doing this, because at first we were sub-patcherizing everything. It's unlike Reactor, for example. Whereas in Reactor, you'll see that if I choose one of these 4 one poles, it has this solid thing, unticked, which means pretend you're just an open patcher, which is a fantastic thing Reactor can do. So of course that's gone straight to Cycling 74 as a feature request, and they say they think they can do that. But the nice thing about this is you see it all as a nice big graph. So you have these 4 one poles identical in a series, and you're able to resolve this delay from the saturator in a single patch, and with this tan H max. again, I have to run through it, but hopefully maybe I can give some of these filters away. My problem with all this is that, as I said at the top, I'm basically a fraud. I'm someone who, I happen to be the sort of person who will spend ages doing this. I like doing it, and I learn lots, creatively I mean, not just practically. And Jen has given me the ability to be able to get into the details of the sound in this sort of a way. But part of me feels I shouldn't have to do this. Part of me feels that realizing zero delay feedback filters is the job of the company who are making my software environment. Of course, it's not a fair thing to say in some ways, because they've given us this great language to get into the details of matters with. But there's certain things I think I really shouldn't be doing that. And they're usually the small details. For example, everyone who uses MSP knows line, curve, tilde, line, tilde, slide, and ramp, smooth. We only have these 4 options for smoothing parameters in MSP, or these 4 out-of-the-box options. And to me, it's the way you smooth a parameter is so important. We should have 10 of them. And in Gen we have 0. In Gen we have to go and do all the details ourselves. We just have this amazing language to play with in a graphical way, or play with with text. And it's really immediate. It's very simple to learn. If you can do Max, you can do Gen. It's much more logical than Max because it's newer. But it does annoy me sometimes. I have to spend a long time building some of these small parts. Then on the other hand, I present Magnetic to you, and I say it's so good I got to go in these very small levels of detail, because I wouldn't have been able to be as creative with it had I not had nothing to start with. And so I can be a real whinger. But listening to the 2 talks before me, it made me feel really happy that I was using Max, and really proud to sort of meet people who are doing these different things with. And everyone will take time on their Max practice, I guess. But sometimes I feel we need a little more helping hand. And largely it's to do with audio quality. So lots of filters in MSP haven't been changed, the code hasn't been changed for ages, and they really need... I basically have a whole swathe of filters in Gen now, and I think they're all better than what's available in MSP. And I don't mind saying that, because it's not because I'm so clever. I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. A lot of it is borrowed code or realized from very well-known sources. But the point is I had to do it. With the case of ladders, how much have I got, 5 minutes? Or? With the case of ladders, they included one I did, there's one included in the Max distribution. This isn't it, this is better than that, because they included it too quickly and didn't give me time to update it. But anyway, there's one which I think it's called Moog Snake. In Max 7 I have no idea where it is. In Max 6 it's in the examples folder, and it's in the Gen examples folder. And this is a unit delay realization of a ladder filter, meaning it's got that 1 sample delay, and you can hear the difference when you sweep your source. But it's just a C sound opcode, which says a lot about Max that I had to port a C sound opcode. And it's just, this is a C sound ladder by one of the Finnish guys, I think. Let's just quickly hear this sweep. So I'm going to sweep the input. So you hear as I sweep, when the input, the oscillator becomes the same frequency or a multiple frequency of the filter, you get this big whoa, this sort of surge on its input. And that's not actually analog behaviour, that's digital behaviour. And if you go back to Radars Compare, let's switch it to it's incredibly smooth. There's not this bump, the same sort of bump. If you didn't hear it, take my word for it. That's one of the things. One of the other things it can do for you. It hasn't all been about trying to implement these sorts of things. Some of it has been more sort of traditional computer music-y. I was researching Foreman filters, and I wanted a real vowel filter, like Hans played us earlier. But I got sidetracked into a weird Foreman thing.
Notion that for a long time this discussion about quality has thought that this is some kind of objective thing. You know, this thing you'll hear very often, Supercollider sounds better or Reactor sounds better. And the thing for me that's very different in both of those languages is that there are more options for filters.
Exactly.
And in Reactor, the big push was for analog modelling of filters. So if you wanted something that sounded rich and warm, it was there, ready. And that's what I think Gen has been one of the areas where it's been a really big game changer, because you know, Peter McCulloch's also done some stuff, or Ollie's done another zero delay, SVF and so on, and so you have more options for actually thinking about not just I want to do a filter, but I want to have this sound quality, where quality actually becomes a subjective.
Yeah, it's a subjective, not a.
This is what I want it to sound like.
I mean, yeah, you do hear things between environments a lot, but actually most of us who've used them all know that that's not really true. It's all ones and zeros. But quality is really what it offers you in terms of scope. And one of the things that has always annoyed me about Max is that there's only one SVF, and it sounds like shit actually, the SVF in MSP. There's only one line object. There's only one saw. Saw is a really good oscillator. The thing I hate about saw is there's only one of them. There should be 10, and I shouldn't have to make them in Gen, especially because I'm really bad at oscillators. That's what I feel about some of the content they could be giving with Max. And Supercollider has many, many more options in that way.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Just saying about filter design. I've looked at filter design before in Gen, and hit a stumbling block straight away, which was reading the art of filter design, which says you need to know about complex algebraic equations and stuff like this, and like I haven't got a clue about anything like that. And so if I want to dive into Gen and make a filter, I look at the internet to try and find help, because I'm not in the industry, so I haven't got anybody to ask. And you search Gen and you don't get anything. There's no documentation and nothing about Gen whatsoever. And like the main reason I came today was literally just thought that first step on the ladder, so I can actually get into Gen.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, with books like you cite, they're actually a big conspiracy, and they're to do with making sure no one else wants to do it, by making it just so unappealing and horrible. And there's an entire industry based on this principle, that you need an expert. Secondly, I was the same with Gen when I first got it. I'm incredibly bloody minded, and I will make terrible patches for ages until they work. But I was very lucky because I would just ask people for help, and so I have a few friends I can ask, you know, what's going on, how do I do this? But also, all my first filters were terrible, but they were a lot of fun to build and learn things. And the thing about Max is it rewards learning through failure in a way where a computer programming language doesn't, or at least doesn't in the same way. And and it learns, it rewards mistakes, and so the only thing I did was persistence. In terms of a specific correlation between the language of Max and MSP and Gen and building filters, no, there's nothing. But there are quite a few examples out there. I posted a few on the forum, Ollie posted a few on the forum, and actually you just have to tear them apart. But another great resource is other software. And I'm not a great C programmer, but I do it sometimes. But at least I can read it. And I also read reactor patches and supercollider source and what have these other people done. And so I admit it's down to you, and it's difficult. Sorry, Alex.
Well, I was going to say maybe there's a line to be drawn between, because there are a lot of these kind of engineering type textbooks. There's a good one by Julius Oran Smith that's freely available on the internet, but if you come to them with no maths or not the right level of maths or engineering background, it can be very hard. But I think a lot of us...
That is an understatement.
I have I mean, I have a good maths background and quite, comfortable with complex numbers and so on, and filter design is still something I consider to be like above, I would have to put a few years into it to really design my own filters. A lot of, I guess, what Pete and Ollie and so are doing is looking for algorithms and trying out things that other people, and understanding enough so you understand how to implement it rather than...
I just thought it was ridiculous when I was doing it, the way, like, I go into Gen to go and design a filter, and then 20 minutes later I'm on the Khan Academy looking at algebraic equation tutorials trying to figure out, I need to, like...
There's two things at work there. I should say that I have zero maths proficiency, and people don't believe it, but really I have none. I have max proficiency. And my maths I know because of Max. Basically, my maths teacher was the expression object. And it's sad, but it's true. Secondly, there is no getting away from the fact that if you want to do things like this, you have to get your hands dirty. And you do have to learn algebraic equations. Not to the extent that you could then impress a professor with them, but you have to understand how certain things are working if you want to play with that. Of course, it's different if your big thing is sample manipulation, and then you'll just use someone else's. Everything has its own problems, and if that's something you want to do, then I found there weren't shortcuts. You do actually have to, but it's whether you're into the idea of the payoff. And the payoff is, for example, there's filters by all friends I have in this room that I then take and think, oh, but I want to change it somehow, and I know how to now, and that's a very powerful thing creatively.
I think also that there are different levels of filter design. Like you can design a new biquad that has all this math and algebra and stuff going in, or you can just plug a saturation in and feed it back in and see how it sounds. It might not be correct, but people shouldn't be afraid of being wrong. If it sounds good and it does something interesting, you've designed a new filter.
In a way, it's very similar to hardware design, actually. When you design a filter in hardware, there's also textbook equations how you do it, but there's a lot of examples in synthesizer history where people designed filters who weren't really good in math, and the result were distortions in the feedback path, and all kinds of things which were technically wrong and which we adore these days. So the beauty about doing, and I myself am exactly in the same boat as those guys. My math background is a nightmare. My math teacher killed it, and I learned it also by necessity of doing it. And I also find it beautiful to simply know enough to get an idea why something doesn't work. My math background is just big enough to understand that if this number is now adding to 10 million, then it's probably wrong because it should be around 1.
This is classic. The amount of 10 million numbers I get. It should. There's a reason we're using Max if you are using Max. And if you're a professor of mathematics and you want to create the greatest virtual analog emulation of a ladder, then you wouldn't really be using Max, I don't think. But if you wanted to do something, you were that same person, but you wanted to do something really screwy and exciting, you might use Max. The things I showed today, I must admit, maybe I was worried or embarrassed, but I only showed my best stuff. There's a lot of crap. I actually have a fantastic filter made by Matt, my friend Matt here, who took some of my individual filters and completely screwed with them, adding these weird saturations in between and these breaking out paths and coming up. and it's fantastic. And of course, my OCD goes, oh, but you know that cable is in the wrong place. But it's just that's what Max and Jen can do for us, is we can be creative.
There were some more questions.
I have one like more Reactor versus Max question. I'm wondering why, at least in like more pop or club dance production, the Reactor is quite dominating. It has like some like cutting edge synths and samplers, and nothing like this comes from the Max environment. So I was wondering if this is something that could possibly change with Gen, or I don't know. What do you think? Why Max is somehow still more Gen?
No, before we pass that over to the obvious person, I would just say that, that there's a lot of when you hear someone say something as if it's a given or understood as a thing which is or happens, it's not often true. And actually, there are as many Max patches in clubs as there are Reactor patches, or at least there were. It's a ridiculously difficult and long conversation because there's some things which are true and some which aren't, that I don't really feel I'm able to answer. But other than to say, I appreciate and love both softwares, and I know both softwares and use them, but I mainly just use Max. And it's to do with how I am and how I like doing things. But it has to be said, there's a lot more content for Reactor, but that's a different thing. There's a guy in the room, I don't know if he minds, but who's worked for both Native Instruments and Ableton, and has been through that relationship firsthand.
I mean, just to address the point, I think they're both just languages, really.
Yeah.
And to some extent, Max has even been a much more open language for longer than Reactor. Reactor only had core, which is like Gen, for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years. And Max, I guess, has had externals for much longer. So in some sense, it would be really silly to say that Reactor sounds better than Max, because it's only what you put in it. I think the real difference is the way the attention was driven onto the two platforms. So like Reactor, in being limited to just sound and not being able to access the internet or do crazy interfaces with Weave controllers or something, naturally just focused itself in that direction. And there's really only probably like 7 people in the world really doing new stuff in Max. Everyone in Reactor, most people are just recobbling stuff together in interesting and creative ways. And now I think the same thing is starting to happen in Max. I don't know why. I think it's just people are shifting their attention in that direction. So to answer your question, I think yes, it will change, and it is changing. I don't know why, but they're both just blank canvases. It's just a matter of who steps up and starts to paint.
And of course, Native Instruments' whole marketing strategy, very successfully so, is based on content. And if you buy a Native Instruments product, you buy the promise of you unpack it and you dial in a preset and you get a world. And this is what a lot of people really, that's how a lot of people actually work. That's the reason why all their stuff is successful in this world. The concept of Max is not, here is your great thing with tons of content and you can produce a hit with it. It comes from a very different background. And,
The concept of Max is, here is this great thing and it will destroy your life. I actually had a tiny amount of social life before Gen came out, and now I have none. But it's whatever floats your boat, as they say. It's what I do. It's what I like to do.
I resent that.
I think Pete, yes. I realised I gave the wrong introduction. I meant to introduce not about us meeting yesterday, but the first time we met, because Pete may have slightly undersold his attention to detail. The first time we met online was an email from Pete to me about the Max Power convolution reverb, in which he said, "You do know that this panel has a roundness of 4 pixels on this corner, but only 6 pixels on the other corner. I do hope that you're going to fix that, because it's driving me crazy."
What Alex is now not saying about this story is he said, "Well, I didn't do the interface, but I'll tell who did."
Was it Mac?
I would just, before ending, I would just like to publicly thank Alex for inviting me. It's fantastic to be here. And I'd also like to thank my friend Matt, a lot of whose co-coding I showed today. Matt, if it wasn't for Matt, I would never have finished the Max patch. I think they were all half done, and Matt helped me finish patching, so thanks to him.
I feel like you finished my
Before we...
Just a quick one. You said you were, all three of you, I guess, you were working collaboratively on math patches, or is it just the code? Because how do you go about using maps collaboratively?
At the moment we're working on actually C++ code, and I guess our solution to that is, apart from having a GitHub, that essentially the code has one owner.
Right.
So we haven't, I don't think anyone other than me has pushed any of that code up, and we've just done it through discussion. But I know that they've changed Max patches to be more Git friendly if you set them up in a certain way, and the person in the room to talk to about that is Rodrigo, because you're putting your stuff on GitHub now?
Yeah.
Is that right? So it is possible to use Git in a way, or a tool like that, that will help you manage, but you have to set it up because the numbering system in the old patches used to change. So if you put like a new patch code in or something, then the numbers would change, and then the whole thing looked different to Git.
Yeah.
And they realized that people wanted to do this, and they put in an option to use it, but you'd need to switch it on.
Yeah, I should have shown what there's lots I didn't show. I should have shown a library. You see, in Max 7 you have this new snippet system, so you can access code very quickly. And here, all this SRM stuff, these sub lists, that's me and Matt. And everyone has a different, and there's just masses of code in there. And we collaborate via Dropbox like that. And so we'll push. It's actually a nightmare. It doesn't work very well. I shout at Matt a lot about it, or I used to. But GitHub would be fantastic actually for that. But it wouldn't quite work with this system. But this easily accessible large library like that in Max 7 is the best bit about Max 7. It's possible to have your Dropbox folder just dynamically linked into your packages folder in Max 7. So that's quite an easy way to collaborate. In terms of us three collaborating, we're working on a specific project, but when we break out to ideas, it's a Max patch, and then we come back to the code.
A quick question on the, because I was thinking of doing something like that using Dropbox to push things across like that. Have you found any problems with it breaking symbolic links or anything?
Yes, but all the problems I've had are with weird interim beta versions of Max. Like the ones they push out publicly,
Right.
I think there's not been any problems, because they've been trying to rework the browser system to be as rock solid as possible, and so it understands your symbolic links. And so far it's been fine with symbolic links, but sometimes with the new Max 7 browser you have to manually rebuild the database.
Right.
But
Every time you add stuff?
No, just
All right.
sometimes.
Right.
This is Max. It's not consistent. It's weird. It's basically fine.
But do you think there's probably some flaws within Max that you can actually use to make something unique and to your advantage?
Yes. This 4:05, so that's why I only answered.
Maybe you can grab Pete in a minute. So can we say thank you very much, Pete?